Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I'm also very lucky to be the president of the Urban Institute and to have the pleasure of welcoming you from all across the country and to thank you for joining us for this discussion of how important stable housing is as a critical first step towards racial equity. You'd think we've been doing this long enough, but I need to do a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded. The recording and links will be posted online afterwards if you want to return or encourage others to. Live captions are turned on. If you want to turn them off, visit the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. All of the participants are muted, but please, if you have questions or comments, put them in the questions box at any time. We will be sharing a link to a post-event survey, and it really helps us if you would give us your feedback. We'd love to hear for both us and the panelists to hear what you're thinking about, so it shapes what we do in the future. Finally, join the conversation online on Twitter by using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So now we can begin. It feels like we might be finally turning a corner on the pandemic after 15 months, at least here in the US. In my life, and maybe for many of you, thanks to our vaccines, we're seeing some normalcy. And while there was a human toll on many whom I love and many others, we are the lucky ones with great resilience. However, last week's action by the CDC to issue one final 30-day extension on the eviction moratorium reminds us that for maybe 6 million families who face eviction, there remains enormous barriers to recovery and a potential lasting consequence for their families, neighborhoods, and communities. In just a few minutes, we will hear from my colleague, Mary Cunningham, who leads Urban's Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. She'll set the stage for us with evidence about the impact of COVID-19 on housing stability, and particularly how Black, Indigenous, and Latinx households have fared during this crisis. But before we hear from her on the challenge and the urgency of this moment, I want to talk for 1 minute about the opportunity that it also presents for a new framework and to right some long-standing wrongs. Over the past year, the pandemic cast a new light on housing instability and on racial disparities in all facets of our society. While the light was new to many, these inequities were not. More than a decade of imbalance in the rental market has resulted in high rent burdens, evictions, and homelessness for millions of people. For BIPOC communities, the disproportionate burdens trace back for generations, whether through redlining by government actors, discriminatory lending practices across the mortgage market, or in the segregation and exclusionary zoning that persists in local communities today. This country's housing policies and practices have harmed BIPOC households and robbed communities of color of not only housing stability, but some of the most foundational mechanisms for wealth accumulation and economic mobility. It's important to name the long history of these harms and the actors that perpetrated them so that we're better able to recognize the long shadow of structural racism when we see it, reflected in today's disparities, like the disproportionate rates of housing instability, income loss, and morbidity that Mary will talk about. It also helps us to recognize the scale of bold change that will be required to remedy these harms and ensure that equitable outcomes and housing stability for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities will follow. But while the current crisis highlighted the interconnected challenges of instability and racial inequities, it also offered a unique opportunity to bring racial equity to the fore as we respond, an opportunity we cannot afford to waste. Right now, we are seeing the federal government take on responsibility to address housing inequity. For the first time from the highest office of the land, owning responsibility for creating and perpetuating disadvantage. I speak of the president's first executive order on advancing racial equity and a subsequent memorandum on discriminatory housing practices and policies. These steps represent a sea change moment and the policy that follows across the government in its wake. The administration is also doing all they can to avoid evictions. If you aren't aware, tomorrow from 1 to 2, they'll be hosting a public near-term eviction prevention summit. Encourage people to tune in. And what's more, the White House is trying to make the case for investing equitably in housing infrastructure to build back better from the pandemic. While even these contested investments will not solve the rental housing crisis entirely or repair historic inequities faced by Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities, I hope we are seeing a moment that we can seize for positive change. So today's event is a challenge to all of us. A challenge: can we capture the opportunity of this moment to do more? Do more to address the underlying issues that have contributed to shrinking supply and unaffordability. Do more to restructure our systems to remedy the harm to BIPOC households. And do more to bring an equity lens to policies and practices and future decisions across all levels of government and in the private and philanthropic sector. Here at Urban, our job is to inform all of these changemakers and arm them with evidence and facts so they can make better and more equitable decisions by focusing on those most affected and the risks they face. And in today's event, we'll marry facts with voices and vision of changemakers. We'll hear from federal and local actors who are driving evidence-based strategies that advance racial equity and ensure housing stability. My colleague Monique King-Wieland will talk with practitioners, officials, and leaders in this work, starting with Arthur Jemison, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development at HUD, and Noel Poyo, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Economic Development at Treasury. And my congratulations to both of these terrific picks on their new post. We'll also be joined by the folks doing the work on the ground. And we're really pleased to have Rashida Phillips of Community Legal Services in Philadelphia and Anthony Simpkins of Neighborhood Housing Services in Chicago. But first, I just want to thank JPMorgan Chase for supporting both this event and an important portfolio of just-in-time research and analysis. Urban's been collaborating with JPMorgan Chase for many years now to produce evidence-based insights that inform both the field and the firm's own philanthropy. As JPMorgan Chase has expanded its philanthropic focus on housing recently with major new commitments, we're advising them and their grantees on how to test and scale innovative affordable housing solutions, such as eviction prevention programs and ways to address appraisal gaps to better serve Black and Latinx households. We're also grateful for their support for data-driven insights we've been able to provide to the Weekly Renters and Rental Crisis Working Group, or as host of the Housing Crisis Research Collaborative, which is a platform for housing researchers from multiple institutions to produce insights to chart our recovery. So here I'm lucky and would like to thank again and introduce former Senator and HUD Secretary Mel Martinez to share some reflections. As a public servant and still today, Senator Martinez has been a champion of housing and homelessness issues. For the last 10 years, he's also been the chairman of the Southeast US and Latin America for JPMorgan Chase. We're very pleased to have you with us, Senator. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for your kind introduction and for those challenging opening remarks. I want to thank the Urban Institute also for hosting this really important and timely event, focusing on this important issue. As a Floridian and former elected and public servant from this great state, I can tell you that the need for affordable housing and stable housing has never been more acute. You don't have to live in Florida to know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated housing instability for millions of people nationwide. Solving this issue requires significant investment from companies like JPMorgan Chase, but it also requires that business leaders, government representatives from both sides of the aisle, and community leaders work together to tackle this issue and develop housing solutions for all. The Urban Institute is what brings us together today. Through them, we can work to craft solutions that can address our immediate urgent needs and create strategies that will meet the needs of our communities tomorrow. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers today, including Arthur Jemison, Secretary. Good luck at HUD. It's a tough place, but a lot of good can be done there. So I wish you the very best. And then also Noel Poyo from Treasury, where he's also looking forward, I know, to serving these communities that are so desperately need the help. We're also going to be hearing from many others from nonprofits and community organizations that are at the forefront of this issue at a national and local level. As leaders of this discussion today and every day, you understand what is needed to have meaningful impact on the people who need it most, particularly those in minority communities. For JPMorgan Chase, increasing affordable housing is a key area of focus. We've recently made a $400 million philanthropic commitment toward this goal. But our commitment goes beyond a straight dollar amount. We're also driving new policy solutions and initiatives in partnership with the Urban Institute to promote housing stability and affordability. Pursuing the right policies is a critical part of making sustainable change. Our commitment includes combining our business data, policy, and philanthropic resources to improve housing stability for all, especially those in Black, Indigenous, and Latinx households. We hope to see meaningful impact for the people who need it the most, and will continue to partner with the public sector at the federal, state, and local levels to ensure that that is the case. So I'm delighted to be a part of your day here today, and I look forward to hearing from this really dynamic panel. Thank you, Sarah. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mary Cunningham.
Thank you, Senator Martinez. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for being here today. Good afternoon, everyone. My job today is actually to tee up today's discussion by providing an overview of what the data say on housing instability. And I'm going to start by taking us back in time and looking at housing insecurity before COVID. Then I will talk next about what the pandemic and how it affected renters, and then bring us to where renters are now. So we can go to the next slide. So let's start by looking at housing insecurity before COVID-19. Next slide. We were already deep into an enduring and persistent housing crisis when COVID-19 hit in March of 2020 and the country shut down. 11 million renters were paying more than half of their incomes towards rent. 20% had less than $400 in savings, leaving them to make difficult decisions about whether or not to pay their rent, pay for their healthcare needs and medical needs, or to put food on the table, and leaving many vulnerable to eviction and homelessness. At that time, nearly 500,000 people, actually more than 500,000 people, were homeless on any given night. Rental housing was in short supply. There was a shortage of about 7 million homes for extremely low income renters. And our housing safety net was and still is woefully underfunded. Only 1 in 5 households who are eligible for assistance actually received it. Next slide. It's important to note that these challenges do not affect everyone equally. Due to our country's history, starting with slavery and then extending to racial and economic segregation, housing discrimination, redlining, Black and Latinx and Indigenous people especially have been denied rights and access to opportunities. This history often plays out in our housing outcomes. For example, Black and Hispanic renters are disproportionately cost burdened compared to white renters. Next slide. With so many renters struggling to pay the rent each month, eviction is a grim outcome that many face. According to the Eviction Lab, nearly 3.7 million filings from landlords for eviction happen each year. Almost 900,000 renters were evicted each year. And people of color, especially women of color and single parent headed households, are at highest risk for eviction. Less than 10% of tenants have legal representation in eviction proceedings across the courts nationwide. Next slide. With all of these housing disparities further upstream, it shouldn't come as a surprise that many people of color are disproportionately experiencing homelessness. The difference is especially stark among Black individuals, who make up 13% of the population, but 40% of the homelessness population, people who experience homelessness. Next slide. Now let's turn to how the pandemic affected and perpetuated housing insecurity and racial disparities among renters. Next slide. Low-income renters were more likely to work in industries vulnerable to COVID-19. That includes accommodations and food, construction, entertainment, retail, all of the service industries that came to a screeching halt when the country shut down. They're also more likely to be essential workers. Next slide. Unemployment skyrocketed. At its peak in April 2020, unemployment reached almost 15% overall. But again, it didn't affect everyone equally. For Black people, unemployment peaked at almost 17%, and for Latinos, unemployment peaked at almost 19%. As of May, the unemployment rate has fallen from its peak to about 5.8%. However, the unemployment rate for Black people is 1.5 times as high at 9.1%. And the unemployment rate for Latinos is also above average at 7.3%. Next slide. People of color are not only affected by the economic impacts of COVID-19, but also the health impacts. The impacts on deaf, Black, and Latinx people were overrepresented in every single age group. Next slide. From March to December 2020, Congress didn't respond adequately to the needs of renters, leaving millions behind, falling behind on their rent. Many were helped by unemployment benefits and stimulus checks, but that was not enough, and many of these programs left people out. In September 2020, the CDC adopted a national moratorium that prevented evictions. This was on top of the many states that had already adopted local moratoriums. Next slide. While some evictions were still happening, these measures kept evictions down. The GAO compared evictions in 63 jurisdictions and found that places with local protections had the greatest change in eviction filings from 2019 to 2020. And researchers from the Eviction Lab estimate the national moratorium prevented 1.5 million evictions. Next slide. It was very difficult then, and still is, to quantify the amount of back rent owed while this was really all happening. And estimates ranged from 11 billion to 53 billion. As I noted, unemployment benefits and stimulus checks helped many people, but may not have covered all of the rent. And rental debt remains substantial despite gains in the labor market. The Philadelphia Fed estimates that households of color and female-headed households in particular have greater rental debt. Next slide. In December 2020 and March 2021, nearly a year after the pandemic start, Congress allocated almost $47 billion to rental assistance. Most of these funds are running through Treasury and flowing down to states and local housing agencies. Treasury, to their credit, stood up this program practically overnight and allocated funds quickly to states and localities. Funds, as I said, are administered by state and local housing and community development agencies. 10% of these program funds can be used for housing stability services, such as housing and counseling, as well as legal supportive services. And they also prohibit the use of, they prohibit eviction of renters for non-payment of rent during the months of receiving assistance. Some and many programs also cover a longer period of assistance from 30 to 90 days. Next slide. So what's the situation for renters now as vaccination distribution efforts continue across the country and states have, for the most part, opened up their economies? Next slide. The answer is that renters and landlords are still struggling. Over 7 million renters are behind on rent in March and in June of 2021. It's more than 7 million renters are behind on rent in June. So you'll see on the blue bar, that is the March data, and then in the sort of orange yellowy bar, that is the June data. 17 and 14% respectively of adults in renter households were not caught up on rent. Next slide. On the left side of this slide, we have the data from March, and on the right, we have the data from June. And you'll see that Black and Latinx and Asian renters are more likely than white renters to be behind on rent. In June 2021, 10% of white renters were not caught up on rent, compared to 24% of Black, 16% of Hispanic, and 15% of Asian renters. Next slide. Low-income renters are also more likely to be behind on rent, and this was true in March and is still true in June. Next slide. The Census Pulse survey asks about people's confidence in paying the rent in the future. 1/4 of adults in renter households had no or slight confidence they could pay the rent in July. And the disparities in race and ethnicity and in income follow the similar pattern that I described previously, with low-income renters and people of color disproportionately reporting lower confidence in their ability to pay in the future. Next slide. Finally, almost half of those who are behind on rent believe that they are somewhat or very likely they'll be evicted. In March, 49% of those who were behind on rent thought there was likely that they would be evicted. And in June, it's slightly lower at 46%. Next slide. So this is at a time when $47 billion is available in rental assistance. We know that rental assistance hasn't yet gone to everyone who needs it, and it's hard to exactly know what's going on. We're still waiting for data from Treasury to really tell us how much of the rental assistance has been allocated from states and localities. Anecdotal reports suggest that some places are getting money out the door quickly and others have been slower. Avail partnered with the Urban Institute with my colleagues Lori Goodman and Joan Choi to survey more than 1,000 landlords and 1,300 renters to better track what's going on and how assistance is getting to folks. And this survey was done in May. And what we found was that from February to May, the tenants' awareness of rental assistance did increase by 12 percentage points. Next slide. But the reasons that most tenants cited for not applying for assistance was because of uncertainty for receiving funds and complicated eligibility criteria. Other reasons were difficult finding assistance and communicating with landlords. Next slide. Communicating with tenants and complicated eligibility criteria were the reasons why landlords were not applying for assistance, as well as having to waive evictions during the period of assistance were the biggest reasons why some landlords chose not to apply for ERA. Next slide. So we are once again about 1 month away from the eviction moratorium expiring. The clock is ticking on getting rental assistance to renters who need it the most. And importantly, making sure that, as Sarah said, we're capturing this opportunity, that we're making sure that billions of dollars that are flowing are not only helping renters, but are also being used to advance strategies that address racial inequities that have persisted for so long and that the pandemic has exacerbated. And finally, after we get through this eviction crisis, that we really focus on the long term, that we can try to think about how to rebuild the housing safety net so that we don't find ourselves in the same place when the next disaster or pandemic hits. So that, I want to thank you all for coming today. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Monique King-Velan.
Thank you so much, Mary, and good afternoon, everyone. Mary, I really appreciate the presentation because it was really good in doing some context framing for the incredible discussion that I hope to have next with our panelists. I'd like to welcome our panelists, Arthur, Rashida, Noel, and Anthony. I'm not going to go through their bios. Sarah mentioned their titles earlier, and their bios, links to them will be included in the chat because I want to jump right into our conversation, but welcome to all the panelists. Noel, I want to start with you. Of course, the most pressing housing stability challenge in the immediate term is ensuring that we can keep people who have experienced economic impacts due to the crisis housed. And Mary just mentioned some of the challenges with reaching tenants and owners with emergency rental assistance funds. And of course, last week, President Biden announced a 30-day extension to the national eviction moratorium that included revised guidance to support state and local governments. Can you talk a little bit about what steps Treasury is taking to ensure that these funds reach households by July 31st?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Monique. It's a pleasure to see you and to be in this panel with my colleagues. And thanks to Urban for setting this up. I agree that the framing information provided was really useful for contextualizing this. So, you know, if you saw the announcements last week, not only the extension of the CDC eviction moratorium, but the associated policy announcements from not just Treasury, but across the administration. And if you saw back on May 7th, something similar, where there were a range of announcements from Treasury and the administration. And then back in March, when there were updates to the Treasury program, you will see this administration is all in on trying to solve this incredible challenge, right? And, you know, I tell you, I don't mind a bit when people say to us, it's not good enough yet, because it's not. Right? There are people, as was absolutely correctly framed, folks who are not getting rental assistance yet that need it. And so we are doing everything we can to make that happen. Let me give you a few examples, but I think it is important to add to the context that was provided that, you know, we saw the number of evictions that were happening on a regular basis in this country prior to the pandemic. Eviction was a basic fact of life for many low-income people prior to this pandemic. And the moratoria during the pandemic are what have kept that from becoming just absolute wildfire through the marketplace. And so we have reason to be concerned, right, about when the moratorium ends. But there was not in this country an infrastructure for delivering rental assistance. Indeed, there wasn't even really an infrastructure for tracking what evictions happened and didn't happen. And so the focus that we are putting now on this and standing up programs really has been an almost ground up effort. As was appropriately mentioned, the dollars that we received from Congress, and we're grateful to Congress for making all this possible, we have passed on rapidly from Treasury to states and localities and tribes and territories. There are many, many, many state and local entities that are administering programs. Many of them didn't have programs. And when we began this process, the prior administration released initial regulations that were very challenging, made implementation, I think, very difficult. Those were released the day before inauguration. And so we immediately out of the gates tried to have a sensible and reasonable way of lowering the burden. And so we did that in March. And then in May, we listened to advocates and to grantees and to landlords about how could we make this program work better. And we came back and we released a range of additional updates to our guidance, including ensuring direct access to these funds for tenants in places where landlords were not necessarily taking up the program. And then here, just this last week, we kept listening, right? And so this last week, you saw FAQs released that supported, that make it clear that dollars can be used to support eviction prevention and particularly eviction diversion efforts in coordination with courts. Eviction happens in the courts, right? And so we want to be there to make sure that even if folks haven't heard about it up until that point, that judges and landlords and tenants know this resource is there to prevent it, even if it has to be at the last minute. We have emphasized the need for language access and culturally relevant housing stability services, not out of some theoretical sort of commitment to this stuff, because we are watching it work. We are seeing where these sorts of steps actually increase the uptake, right? Increase the access for populations that need it most. We've provided a method, and I'm really interested to see how this plays in the market, for grantees to provide a letter of commitment to people who are experiencing homelessness, or maybe in the process of an eviction, or maybe moving from one place to another, regardless of whether it's an eviction, but they don't have a rental obligation. And that's required by the statute. You can't ignore what Congress says, right? And so we were working through how is it that we could make sure and get dollars to folks who are in that critical moment. And so we've offered states and localities a way of doing it. So you get a sense of just, how we're leaning into this, and we are putting pressure. We understand on states and localities that are trying really hard, but we are also seeing many make it work, and that increases our view of our need to also hold accountable those that are not moving dollars. And we are looking, as the Deputy Secretary of Treasury has made clear, we are looking to September when we have the statutory authority to reallocate funds from grantees that are not moving dollars to those who are. We are taking that very seriously. And we're in this moment now, as you said, the next 30, 45 days are critical, and we're watching.
Thank you, Noel. I want to go from that federal perspective and almost sort of zoom in now to where the rubber sort of meets the road, right? And I'd like to shift to Rashida. Rashida, we know through the research that evictions impact households of color at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. Mary touched on a little bit of this in her presentation earlier, and that it's often households with children who are impacted. In your role, you're working on an innovative local program to help prevent or divert evictions before they even get to the filing stage. Can you talk a little bit about that model and how it's impacting Black, Indigenous households of color in Philadelphia?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Monique, and thank you for having me today. So absolutely, just as was talked about earlier, we're seeing the same things in Philadelphia. Prior to the pandemic, Black families were overrepresented in the eviction system, overrepresented in the homelessness system in our city, and Black female-headed households in particular, over 74% of the 20,000 on average eviction filings each year were Black female-headed households. And then where we also were seeing these evictions happen are in the same place that have been historically redlined areas of the city. And so we knew, right, that there was an issue long before the pandemic hit, and had tried some solutions, right? We had tried a right to counsel pilot program. We had also tried out a diversion program, but it was not required, it wasn't mandatory, and it wasn't connected to the court system. And so with the pandemic came the opportunity, right, came the urgency, came the sort of compounding of crises as it became evident that the people most impacted by COVID-19 are Black and Hispanic families in the city. And that likewise, the same people are seeing, again, that overrepresentation of evictions in those areas during the pandemic. It became evident that we needed other solutions, and that it was not just pack the courts with a bunch of lawyers, right? That's a part of it, right? But that we needed something else. And so that's when our city came together and passed legislation setting up a mandatory pre-filing eviction diversion program. That program's mandatory nature expired on March 31st of this year. And so our court picked up leadership and created a order requiring landlords to both apply for rental assistance and apply for eviction diversion before they were allowed to file in court for non-payment of rent cases. And so our eviction diversion program, right, that mandatory nature being extremely necessary, the pre-filing nature being extremely necessary so that people don't get those eviction records that follow them for life. But in addition to that, our eviction diversion program is comprised of multiple partners that include mediators, include housing counselors, include people who can connect folks to other resources, who can help them apply for the rental assistance application and walk them through the process, as well as help with that relationship breakdown that might have occurred between a landlord and a tenant. So there's a lot of different supports built in to make it work and not just have it be, a sort of replication of what happens in court. It's not something that works out for a lot of families. In terms of who it's helping, we are seeing just from the statistics so far that, again, Black families are overrepresented, which is, both a good thing, right, in that they're getting the help that they need. We've seen that they are represent about 66% of the people who have both applied for rental assistance and applied for going through the eviction diversion program. However, we're seeing very low numbers in terms of Hispanic and Latinx families, as well as other families, right? And so it begs the question, are Black folks uniquely experiencing this pandemic and other folks aren't having the same sort of issues, or are we missing those folks? Are we not able to reach them? Are they not accessing it? So I think we still have some questions to ask about this and make sure that everyone is able to access these programs if they need them. But I think what we're seeing so far is that it is doing what it's intended, and that it's tool that both helps achieve racial equity around who's being evicted and then who gets those records that then follow them for life. It's working well with other programs that we have, such as Right to Counsel, and again, our very robust housing counseling community here.
Thank you, Rashida. If you don't mind, I want to ask a follow-up question. Associate Attorney General Gupta issued a letter to all the state court chief justices and state court administrators last week, encouraging state courts to set up eviction diversion programs. I'm curious to hear your opinion or thoughts on that letter and what more might be needed to prevent evictions locally, or for folks to think about implementing a model like yours across the country.
Yeah, it was absolutely great to see that letter come out. We as an advocate community think it's responsive, it supports and acknowledges what housing advocates and courts and governments, around the country have been doing to sort of come up with these creative ways to prevent evictions. And again, understanding that, these various crises are compounding and more people than ever are dealing with these issues. And so we were very encouraged by that letter. And I think many have made this point, right, that the metaphor of this tidal wave of evictions, these things, is no longer apt, because these evictions are not natural disasters. They are things that can be prevented when all of the right players and components come together. And I think the letter went a far way in acknowledging that. Unfortunately, in Philadelphia, our order mandating that landlords apply for rental assistance and go through the diversion program before filing expires tomorrow. We're unsure of the status of the extension of that as of today. And that letter was extremely encouraging in supporting what I think our courts would like to do, which is to try to extend this order, because they understand that this program is working and working well. And I think, some of the things that can be done and what I think the government can do to continue to support this is continue issuing things like federal guidance. I think it's extremely critical because it gives that political cover. It encourages courts, like the DOJ letter, encourages courts to do this more creative work and to think of and to try to find ways to do these innovative measures. Funding to pay for diversion programs, funding for organizations like the National Center for State Courts to be able to continue working to support courts with these new and innovative models that they may not have tried out before. Making the rental assistance programs as flexible as possible, rewarding jurisdictions who do that innovative work with more funding, who are trying ways to get rental assistance out quickly and pairing it with diversion type measures, and then sort of continuing to share these models and convene leaders to share their experiences. I've been very encouraged by being able to come together with leaders around the country for conversations like this, to hear about what's working and what's not, and to try out different things. And I think the government can play a huge role in encouraging that and uplifting that. And then just a couple of other things, being able to provide technical assistance to courts setting up diversion programs, using the Fair Housing Act as guidance and ensuring that folks are complying with that. I think that, again, works with diversion and some of its possibilities. And then what we would love to see is requiring non-eviction for at least 60 days following receipt of emergency rental assistance funds and other measures that tie into receipt of that rental assistance.
Thank you so much, Rashida. Anthony, I want to come over to you. In your role, you are often working with owners of rental housing, particularly that sort of small 1 to 4 unit owner. How are smaller landlords, who the data and evidence says are more likely to be immigrants and Black, Indigenous people of color, than owners of large multifamily, faring right now during this time?
Well, thank you for that. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Small landlords not only tend to be people of color, but they also tend to be owner occupants and residents within the communities that are being impacted by COVID-19. They're much less likely to be able to be in an economic position to weather the storm of lost rental income. And they also are primarily the maintainers of affordable rental housing as well. Something like 1/3 of affordable, of low-income renters in the city of Chicago, where we're located, are residents in units in buildings that are owned by small landlords, anywhere from 2 to 4 dwelling units. So they are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and all of the attendant inability of renters to pay rent and the moratoriums on evictions, and are much more likely to need assistance, not only for their residents, but also mortgage payment assistance as well. And so in Chicago, we are trying to, we're specifically putting together some programs to address the small landlords to provide assistance both to the owner-occupant landlords of 2 to 4 unit properties and also to the tenants that they rent to. Something like 1/3 of the housing stock in the city of Chicago is owner-occupied 2 to 4 unit properties that are almost exclusively provide affordable rental units to low-income residents as well. So it's a really critical space in the marketplace that is being affected by the realities of the pandemic.
So, I mean, given that significant number in the market and how you know that they're faring right now during this time, what are the measures that you recommend that they need or that need to be put in place so that smaller landlords take up available resources and ensure stability for themselves and their tenants?
Sure, absolutely. So, and one of the unique aspects of that is that most of these are owner-occupied, but at the same time, they're not necessarily getting FHA loans, right? So these are commercial loans, and so did not, even at the beginning of the pandemic, did not necessarily benefit from some of the moratoria that were put in place by for loans that were federally backed. Rental moratoriums went in place, and they were particularly impacted. I think that so one of the things that's happening now is that under the new the more recent rental assistance programs, at least in Chicago and other jurisdictions, it's now set up so that the landlords can apply as well as the tenants can apply for the assistance. So this is a method to try and get that assistance to some of the smaller landlords that need it. A lot of the larger multifamily rental owners have systems in place to make sure that this assistance is getting accessed by their tenants. Smaller landlords are not necessarily that sophisticated. So there's definitely a push from neighborhood housing services in Chicago and other organizations like us, a lot of the CDFIs around the country, to make sure that we push that information out to these landlords and provide them the assistance they need to go on and apply and get the information to the tenants to apply for this assistance, because it's really so critical to get them over the hump. So that's one of the things that I think is most important, is just getting the information to them and allowing both tenants and landlords to be able to apply for this assistance.
Okay. The recent administration guidance provided a streamlined payment option for large landlords to access emergency rental assistance on behalf of multiple tenants. Are there any other types of sort of efficiencies or flexibilities that could help the smaller rental housing owners?
Well, again, like I said, allowing rental housing owners, either the tenants or the landlords, to apply for this. I think that there's a slightly deeper issue here. One of the things that we know is that the pandemic has not created, but it's highlighted and in some instances exacerbated sort of inequities that have always been there in our system. So when you talk about people of color who are owner occupants who live in our Black and brown communities, there's always been a differential in their ability to access capital, right? To be able to put the infrastructures in place that would allow them to better weather these kinds of crises, right? To provide the assistance that your tenants might need, to make improvements. So, I mean, really on sort of a broader and more long-term basis, putting programs in place that allow them to access capital on an equitable basis is going to be critically important. So I think we need to sort of, we're sort of concentrating on the short-term solutions here, which are really critical to make sure that people can maintain their homes. And we'll talk a little bit about a program that we're piloting in Chicago to help address both renters and homeowners. But getting them access to capital, because the owners of small rental properties occupy a really unique space. Not only do they provide affordable rental, but rental in and of itself does not build wealth. ownership builds wealth. And so what we're talking about is we're talking about small entrepreneurs that are residents in their own communities and being able to generate resources that allow us to support and build that population of Indigenous property owners is an opportunity to begin to build wealth amongst people of color and communities of color and circulate dollars within the community. So I think that's something that we really need to consider as we consider what are we doing as we come out of the pandemic as well.
Thank you, Anthony. Arthur, I want to come to you. We've heard a lot so far about shoring up housing stability in the immediate aftermath of the expiration of the national eviction moratorium. However, as Mary framed, as Anthony just noted, we started the pandemic already in a housing crisis, and these dynamics, including insufficient supply of housing, particularly for low and moderate income households, and a lack of federal subsidy, will persist far longer than the economic shock of this current crisis, right? So how is the federal government approaching some of these longer term issues in the housing market, and what's needed to stabilize Black, Indigenous households of color and rental housing owners?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here today. So I think what you have seen just since the beginning of the current administration is a very significant series of investments in the people and places that are going to create more mixed income and deeply subsidized affordable supply. And also, you've heard us articulate an agenda towards more supply to be created again in the places that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are located. So I think what I like to kind of do is talk about this in a bit of a temporal way and say, when the American Rescue Plan passed earlier this year, and the amount of money that was dedicated to, for example, rental assistance, went up by $25 billion, right? And we've been hearing and talking about the ways that money can make a big difference. But there were other resources enabled by that act as well, which should get some focus here today. I'm recently left the Detroit city government to join the Biden administration. That city is going to get over $800 million of state and local money that it can use in an extremely flexible way towards the policy goals that that community identifies. Many other places have also spent extensive time working in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and Boston, and they're getting a significant amount of new state and local money that can be used flexibly. That money can be used for affordable housing. And there are ways in which it can be used in combination with other dollars that we discussed here that are really quite innovative and new. But just the order of magnitude that we're talking about, saying to a city like Detroit, you're getting $832 million in 1 year, is a very significant investment and creates a significant series of opportunities for that community. When you think about using that money in combination with the home ARP money, for example, that was passed in the American Rescue Plan, where the community had $5 billion of new home money. That's about 4 times the annual allocation of home that many communities get. That's specifically focused on permanent supportive housing and extremely low income housing. It's really, this is a set of resources that we just haven't had as local leaders in a very long time. And then when you add that to what's been proposed in the American Jobs Plan, the investment in the Housing Trust Fund that's been proposed, the investment in home, and the approach that we want to take to it. Specifically, I think you've seen at the Tulsa Race Massacre Memorial, where the president was present, talked about when we are making these investments in supply, we need to explicitly and directly address appraisal gaps, the histories of red wine and other matters that have been discussed eloquently here. We have the resources to address them if those bills are passed that include those 2 resources. But again, that's not enough. I think we have to say the resource array doesn't matter if you don't have the local administrative capacity to expend those dollars thoughtfully and put together the policy strategy that's going to make the most out of them. And it also needs the voice, the void pulpit of that HUD and CPD and Secretary. So we're intending to bring that part of the conversation to bear over the coming months and have initiatives that directly engage local leaders, combine that with technical assistance that help them fashion those policies, and then really accelerate the ways and the thinking about combining these funds to not just preserve tenancies and preserve the conditions that people had, but try to bounce forward, so to speak, with the many billions of dollars that have been both enacted and proposed. As I talk about this and think about the landscape for resources to invest in the places that I've worked historically and how that landscape has been changed, the opportunity is there, and we just need to make sure that our communities have the people resources, and concepts, the best practices, and the ways of bringing them together that actually attack the problem. Because again, we haven't had this resource array in some time.
Thank you, Arthur. That's actually a really good segue to my next question. I want to sort of bring us back to the first day of the administration when President Biden issued a historic executive order to advance racial equity and support underserved communities through the federal government. I'd like to have all three of you react from your particular vantage points, react to your particular vantage points about this federal commitment to advancing racial equity and what that means for your work, both at the federal level and on the ground. Noel, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you focused on this, that you raised this. There is a real direct line from the phrase used in the campaign, "Build Back Better," to what is happening in the Treasury Department and I believe across the federal government today. Because implicit in that is that, look, we're faced with a crisis, right, caused by COVID. And we've got to dig our way out of that hole. And we're making amazing progress on that. But the end point is not getting back to where we were right before COVID. The opening slides that contextualize this whole conversation is this isn't get back to the regular inequity of America, right? This is build back better. And so what the conversation that happens constantly among my colleagues in the Treasury Department, which is then reinforced by a process that an executive order is a powerful thing, right? A lot of people sort of go through and respond to that. It mobilizes the entire government. And so the conversation is about how do we do better than where we were? And that goes across, I really appreciate that that Anthony brought up, not just sort of immediate housing programs or immediate emergency programs, but how capital flows. So much of what we're thinking about is first, how do we address the emergency? And then second, how do we change how capital flows to ensure that this, we're not going to solve these issues in a day. And so that means we have to build a process that's going to last over time so that we close these gaps that we know exist and that were created by very intentional policy. And so by intentional policy, we will close them. So in any case, that's my 2 cents on sort of how I see some of this.
Thank you, Noel. I appreciated that. Arthur, what about you? The federal commitment to advancing racial equity, what does that mean for you?
Well, for me, what it means is, I get to think about actively with my colleagues how we're going to, lift up the circumstances and change the direction that we're going with the resources we have, and how to use the resources we have to engender the kind of change where people are seeking. I think for us, because it's a slower kind of capital intensive and rules-based system that we're working in, it's really about what are the underlying decisions that and who's at the table in certain kinds of discussions that are guiding expenditures of the capital that we're making available. are the systems that decide how these dollars are going to be spent. Are they designed in a way, the decision-making mechanisms designed in a way that puts people at the table who have, who not just maybe have a knowledge of the circumstances and are educated about the inequities we're trying to address, but also people who have a lived experience of those things and can bring that perspective to a decision-making environment. You know, it's one of the things that happens, when you work as a grantee in the field with folks like Rashida and Anthony, is you hear directly from people who have lived experience of the things you're talking about, and they make it very clear, what's important. And so having that voice as a part of the decision-making process is to me where the transformation happens, because we have as a nation made billion-dollar investments in different things. Have we changed the way we do that? Or are we doing it in, maybe different people are involved and different people are in leadership, but have we changed the method through which we're making those allocation decisions? Does it include more people with different voices who may not have been there before? Are there people who are beneficiaries who they get to make their comment at a community meeting, but are they part of some of the more intimate decision making that where some of the major impacts are going to be felt? So, or other the impacts are going to emanate from those smaller decisions. That's really where I think the challenge is in my space, is how do we make sure that there are more people who are making decisions.
Thank you. I want to go to Rashida and to Anthony. I mean, given your particular vantage points, the work you're doing on the ground, how are you seeing or thinking about the EO and how that impacts your work on a daily basis, or your approach to the work moving forward? Maybe Rashida, will start with you, and then we'll go to Anthony.
Yeah, absolutely. I think similarly, it's really what we're seeing is the beginning of a shift in values. And I think that's the most important place to start. I think when we start to shift our thinking and our mindset to one of equity, to one of valuing people's humanities, to one of abundance over scarcity, and when we begin to name those structures and systems that have gotten us to this place more boldly and more bravely, then I feel like that makes the work for all of us more effective. Like the work that I'm doing is more effective when I'm able to name racial equity at the heart of a policy that shapes, housing in my city. It allows me to then design solutions that will actually help to address that problem rather than sort of obscuring the source of the problem, which then leads to inadequate solutions. And I think to have our president and his administration talk about evictions and to name structural inequity just opens up so many possibilities. To see these things as a national level issue, a crisis, instead of a local issue or a property rights issue, but as one that's worthy of naming as a national crisis and putting significant resources behind it is something refreshing, right, from the previous administration. But I think, right, even after the words, the actions need to follow. And I think we're starting to see that, right? Like just the reinstatement of the AFFH rule, the prioritization of eviction prevention, all of those things represent a shift in those values. And so it's really exciting and it's really useful, but we have to keep pushing. We cannot stop here. So that would be my thing. Like it gives me hope, obviously, but I want to keep pushing and seeing us do more and take it all the way.
Anthony?
Thank you. So yeah, I was really encouraged by the executive order because I think it says very clearly and loudly that when it comes to sort of the ongoing fight that I think many of the people on this panel have been fighting for years, which is a fight for racial and economic equity, we now clearly have an ally in the administration in that fight, and so this is very heartening. And I'm hoping that what it ushers in is, again, like I said before, sort of rethinking this concept of affordable housing. Is sort of rethinking the structures that have been in place for many, many, many years that have perpetuated the kind of inequities we want to address. For instance, low and moderate income, LMI, has been for decades been used as a proxy for race. At this point, it's time to address race directly. When you look at the CRA, for instance, right? We know that when it comes to accessing retail mortgage credit, people of color have less access to mortgage credit irrespective of their income, right? So some of the underlying problems when it comes to equity don't just relate to a person's income. So we need to be able to address these issues of race, because that's at the basis of where the inequities are. We need to be able to address race directly. I think that's number one. I think number two, we have an enormous and active industry that produces affordable rental housing. Affordable rental housing does not generate generational wealth. It's never going to close the racial wealth gap. And when you talk about large projects, large rental projects, they fill a critical need. But when you talk about like the small landlords we talked about, right? These are owner occupants that are building wealth. They're also investing in their own communities. They're providing affordable rental housing. But I think we also need to think about home ownership as affordable housing. Today, in a high cost city like the city of Chicago, a homeowner can pay less for their mortgage than they pay for rent. But when you look at the rules and regulations, the CDFI fund, the Capital Magnet Fund, the New Markets Tax Credits, home, they all skew towards supporting rental housing. There's very little room and very little ability to use these resources to build and expand home ownership among people of color. You are not going to adequately address the racial wealth gap unless you adequately address resources that build home ownership and generational wealth. And one of your greatest allies in that fight is going to be the CDFIs that work on the ground with these communities, with these residents on a daily basis, and have the infrastructure to know how to deploy those resources. Because at the end of the day, it's about access to capital. And it has always been about access to capital. Whether you're talking about somebody that wants to buy a house, whether you're talking about somebody that wants to renovate and buy a 4-flat, or whether you're talking about somebody that wants to open a small business in one of the corridors in our LMI communities, it's about access to capital. And your CDFIs are going to be your partners that can help deploy that access to capital. And I think the final thing would be that when we talk about closing the racial wealth gap, we're also talking, and equity, we're also talking about building communities that have been left behind for decades. And again, home ownership and access to capital are community development resources. So those resources, we need to make sure that the programs that we are administering, the way we distribute resources, are helping the people that need the help the most, but they're also not inadvertently concentrating poverty in these same neighborhoods generation after generation after generation. So we need to think about sort of the scope of people that we're helping. In a community, you need to provide a safety net for those that are at low incomes, but you also need to provide ladders for them to move up. And you also need to provide resources that are going to attract middle-class people of color into these same neighborhoods, because that's how you build communities. You build communities with an equity and income distribution as well. And many of our especially many of our federal programs are focused on limiting resources to households of very low income that live in very low income census tracts. We need to sort of expand our concept of community development so that we're providing resources both for middle class, people of color, and low income people of color, because we know the issues of equity and access to capital are the same for both.
Thank you, Anthony. I really appreciated the comments around wealth building, home ownership, and access to capital. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions before we go to the audience Q&A, and we already have a host of questions in the Q&A box. Really quickly, I have a question for Arthur. You mentioned that you were a former local official in Detroit, I think Boston as well. I too was a former local official, so you know well that when it's great to have new resources, but when you have that sort of new influx, right, of public money coming in after especially a long time of operating without additional funding, you can encounter issues around capacity, technology. How might these issues impede our efforts to be more intentional with these investments? And do you have any thoughts about how state and local jurisdictions can think about tackling those challenges?
Sure. So what I would say is, our grantees, many of them experienced really significant revenue losses during the COVID crisis. I can say for myself that, I had to furlough many people. I had to cause people to go down to 4-day work weeks. I had to take pay cuts. The entire city had to furlough a very significant number of staff people. So when you say suddenly, suddenly we're going to actually have a lot more money, and there's going to be requirements to spend a lot more money, to spend that money with compliance. That's a very different challenge. So, I think one of the things we have to remember is that CARES Act really kind of provokes and sort of begins to touch on this. CARES Act resources came out. There wasn't really a lot of direction about the ways that we should use the money immediately. And then there were also there was a wide array of funds. There was the coronavirus relief funds, FEMA funds, there were funds from HUD, and each of which had different timetables and freedoms and restrictions that were all different. And so when you read the regs and you make a list of what you should spend first, it turns out that the things you spend first may be different than the thing you learn. But again, this is all like higher order thinking that takes time and people to do. So back to your question, I think we really have to make sure that grantees don't just get technical assistance, because in some respects that's something that's valuable, it's good. But if you have someone who's telling someone else to do something, it's just not enough people to do it, you have a problem. So I think we are really going to need support for, in particular, our communities that may not have had the level of administrative support, the staff, the executive leadership that it takes to, sort of turn all these sources into a coherent policy, because that's what it takes. And as a former local official, just how challenging that can be, even if you have a full complement of staff. I mean, my colleagues in Boston have one situation. My colleagues in Detroit have a different one. But they both need a level of access to operating money that gives them the ability to think the ideas through. So I'll give an example. The idea you were talking about with that is now part of the guidance. Use your money to fund large groups of to get large property owners subsidy quickly. That's an idea that people were able to go quickly with in Boston, but it's been a little bit slower to happen in Detroit. So those are some of the things that you get and give when you have more administrative support.
Thank you. One final question before we go to Q&A to Noel. Again, talking about sort of these large investments already in the pipeline and large investments being proposed in federal dollars to support these housing investments. And then that push and pull between speed of getting things to market and also this intentional focus on racial equity. How do you ensure that we're promoting racial equity to meet the spirit of the executive order?
So this is, as I was saying before, this is about not just dealing with an emergency in front of us, but building a system that is going to deploy capital in a way that can solve these things, because even the best design, the best construction to most effectively address a wealth gap that took hundreds of years in this country to create, right, isn't going to get undone in a year or two. And so I think that leads us to some challenges, right, is about how do we build something that can close the gap or the gaps, because they are diverse and different across different populations, and the mechanisms and levers are different if we really get into the details of implementation. But how do we also make sure that those systems survive? And we live in a big and difficult democracy in which that question of survival is going to need to go beyond the opinions of a single federal official or a single administration, and that's hard. I'm not going to hide the ball on this, right? That's hard, and so there is, I think, the challenge ahead of us, right, is to make sure that these programs not only effectively target and effectively address what the data tells us, right, but that they survive. And so this is very much at the middle of what I'm thinking about when I go to bed at night, and what's keeping me up, and the first thing on my mind in the morning is balancing these things, because I don't think there are obvious right answers all the time, and I think it is important. That's why it's important for us in federal government to listen, to be humble, right, about maybe our first idea wasn't the best one, or maybe it's not the only one. And so I think public input is also a critical part of this process of getting it right. So I know that was a response that's a little bit up in the clouds, right? In part because we are indeed in the middle of making a lot of decisions about these things. But I do want to give a sense of really how challenging it is, because once we move from being in a position to make a difference, actually making a difference is going to be complicated. But I think that's why I began comments today by saying, if somebody says it's not good enough, boy, I'm open to that. Like that's the kind of incoming I'm ready to take, right? Because, it couldn't possibly be good enough, right? I mean, that is to say, go slow isn't good enough, right? And so, I hope that we can look back on what we achieved, that it meets that challenge, but that always we are being pushed to do it faster and better.
Thanks, Noel. I want to turn now to the audience Q&A. We have a host of questions popping up in the Q&A box, so we're just going to pull as many of them as we can. Rashida, it looks like this first question is for you. I'm from Denver and hearing about similar disparities in the eviction process. How did you get data in Philadelphia to analyze evictions by race and ethnicity and household type?
Yeah, so one of our legal services, our sister organizations in Philadelphia called Philadelphia Legal Assistance, receives the applications and the phone calls and runs the hotline for the diversion program. So we got demographic data through them. And then for the rental assistance program, the city agency that's administering the program, we're in partnership with them as we support the rental assistance and making sure it gets out. And so we were able to also get demographic data from them.
Thank you, Rashida. It looks like, Anthony, this question is for you. We're hearing from the field that rising property values are providing an incentive for smaller landlords to sell their properties to larger firms. This leads to a loss of landlords willing to work with rental assistance programs. What are you seeing in the field, Anthony?
Well, that's an interesting question. In Chicago, the idea of displacement from a community really has two frameworks. One is in neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification, right? Property values are rising, demographics are changing, people are coming in and buying up everything in sight. And how do you preserve affordable housing, and how do you preserve Indigenous residents in those communities? The converse to that is you have communities, which we normally would call disinvested communities, lower income communities, almost exclusively communities of color. But they're not disinvested communities. What we see predatory investment, right? We see people that are not Indigenous to these communities, to these neighborhoods, often not Indigenous to even the cities or the states where they're located, that are seeing low value assets that they're buying, often homeownership properties that they are turning into rental properties. And it's the kind of investment that doesn't create value for the neighborhoods. It doesn't improve the housing stock in the neighborhoods because, of course, there's a value proposition there, right? So whether they're holding it or they're flipping it, they're doing as little as possible to maintain the maximum amount of profit. And it's eroding the home ownership base. It's eroding the indigenous ownership base. So we are seeing that. We're seeing it in two different ways, right? We're seeing it in neighborhoods that continue to struggle economically, and we're seeing it in neighborhoods that are facing waves of gentrification. And so on the ground in these neighborhoods, right, is the work that cities, that CDFIs, that local organizations like neighborhood housing services do to try and figure out what are the strategies, right, to help people stay in neighborhoods and benefit from the amenities that are coming to a neighborhood that are seeing increased investment, right? And how do we build counterweights against the kind of investment in communities that are still undervalued and still suffer from the vestiges of redlining? How do we create resources for the people in those communities to build and create property ownership and avoid the kind of predatory investment that we see? There's so much cash out here in the real estate market right now. It's unbelievable, especially in many of the high cost cities like Chicago and Denver and DC and New York and San Francisco, Seattle. They're seeing this all the time. They're seeing both kinds of displacement, if you will. And it's something that I think is another direction which we need to figure out how to divert these large amounts of federal resources that are going in to try and help us build communities. It's an issue that we are going to have to work with our federal partners, our local partners, again, CDFIs, our local banking institutions that provide critical investment in these communities. I mean, you know, we just got, neighborhood housing services just got about $1.3 million in the rapid response program from the Treasury, the COVID rapid response program. To Assistant Secretary Pollo's point, we've got two things. We've sort of got the immediate help that these neighborhoods and these household needs. And then it's about being smart about the long-term planning for neighborhood revitalization and equity as we begin to distribute over time these really unprecedented levels of resources, right? We have to be smart about these resources so that we don't ultimately perpetuate the kind of inequities that we're actually supposed to be trying to solve for.
Thank you. I feel like the word of the day is intentional in terms of our approach and our process here. Another question that came in, and I think maybe Rashida, if you could take a stab at this, Anthony as well, but Noel or Arthur, feel free to jump in. One of the catch-22s of the program is the landlord-tenant cooperative link. Some landlords who want to participate are having a hard time getting their tenants to respond or even answer a phone call or knock on a door or text. And on the other hand, some tenants who want to participate are having a hard time getting their landlord to respond, answer the phone, et cetera. What can be done in these cases, I think, to sort of encourage that cooperative link? Maybe Rashida, could you start?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us in Philly, we've tried different things with different phases of rental assistance. And I think in this last round, we've kind of gotten it right. We've paired the rental assistance with the diversion program, which helps with that link, which helps with, you know, some of the relationship breakdown that might have occurred between a landlord and tenant and who's contacting who. And so the housing counselors are able to work through some of those issues once they're hooked up to the diversion program. With the rental assistance application, in this phase of the rental assistance, both the landlords and tenants are able to apply for it. And so the landlord can apply on his own, and the application is sort of meant for the landlord to take the first stab at applying. But if the landlord has not applied, the tenant can also apply for rental assistance on their own. So that's one of the ways we've tried to resolve it, but it's still obviously an issue. And again, I think pairing it with diversion and other resources and supports that can help facilitate that relationship or that communication has been effective here.
No, that's such an important question. You know, in Chicago, we've got an initiative that Neighborhood Housing Services, Enterprise Community Partners, and a number of neighborhood organizations are pursuing, which is called Chicago Flats. Again, it's focused on this small landlord space that is home ownership and affordable rental. And what we're doing is we're providing mortgage assistance, right? Making sure that the owners are accessing the mortgage assistance and that the tenants are accessing the rental assistance. But we're acting as facilitators to get them both together, right? Because they both need to be able to make those applications. They both need to know that the resources are there. We're offering mediation to try and avoid evictions whenever possible. There's legal assistance, like some of the work that Rashida is doing, legal assistance resources that are provided to the tenants. There's resources to help, technical assistance, the landlords to help with their sort of budgeting and some other stuff so that they can get themselves back on their feet and don't feel so compelled to have to evict somebody. So making sure that you're bringing to bear resources that are available to sort of both sides of that landlord-tenant relationship, and working hard to bring those parties together, I think is really important. And I think it's something that's unique to sort of how we're addressing this in Chicago. But I think it's something that's very important. Everybody has suffered from the shock of this pandemic. And so the two sides don't need to be adversaries. They're both suffering, right? So how do we bring them together and bring resources for both of them so that we can maintain this tenancy, right? They don't go through the shock of displacement, and this landlord can maintain their building and their mortgage and their investment at the same time. So I think it's important to make sure we're addressing both things.
Thank you, Anthony. Arthur or Noel, do you have anything you want to add to that question about the sort of connective link? We have a couple more questions I can go to as well in the Q&A, but I wanted to make sure.
No, I think Noel is probably the right one on this one.
Noel, anything to add?
No, nothing to add on this one. I was appreciating listening to the really thoughtful answers here. So nothing more on this one.
Perfect. I think this next question, I'm actually going to go back to Anthony. The question is, what recommendations do you have to reform or any potential reforms in federal programs more specifically focus on advancing affordable home ownership? And I pose it to you, Anthony, just because you mentioned home ownership and wealth gap earlier.
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, we can sort of talk about it generally, but we can also talk about it specifically. I mean, for instance, there are some proposals to provide some assistance to collaborative organizations, nonprofit organizations that are collaborating with cities or CDFIs, that kind of thing. And it is available. See, this gets to this issue of sort of broadening the spectrum of household incomes that you're trying to help support, right? And it says, well, these are going to be resources if you want to do home ownership or you want to do affordable rental up to 120% AMI, but it's a competitive grant and you score at 80% AMI or below, right? The CDFI fund criteria skews towards rental. If you look at the criteria for their competitive grants, right? You score if you're doing rental for very low income individuals in very low income census tracts, right? So there's sort of a recipe in many of the federal grants and federal competitive opportunities that fit a specific rubric. And what I'm suggesting is that reform is going to be about rethinking those rubrics. There needs to be resources for those in greatest need, but there also need to be resources that are directed at middle class people as well, and are directed at creating communities of diversity, not communities of concentration.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I want to thank all of the panelists, Arthur, Rashida, Noel, and Anthony. I also want to thank our president, Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and Mel Martinez for their opening remarks. And thanks to Mary Cunningham for her presentation, which really helped to set the table and frame our conversation this afternoon. And last, but certainly not least, I want to thank everyone who registered and joined us for today's important conversation. As Sarah stressed in her opening remarks, the challenges and the urgency of this moment can't be overstated. The pandemic has exposed the fragile nature of our housing infrastructure, the role systemic racism played and continues to play in higher rates of housing instability for Black, Indigenous people of color pre-COVID, and the dangers of housing instability and racial disparities for both housing and health. Black, Indigenous people of color have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, facing greater unemployment, higher rates of housing instability, eviction and homelessness, and greater loss of life. We missed the life point sometime, and Mary touched on this earlier, greater loss of life. As George Jones noted in a Washington Post article, the pandemic has laid bare a second public health crisis, the full impact of systemic racism. Now is the time for bold action, innovative solutions, and significant investments to turn the tide. And we've heard today from our panel who are working to move the needle from a variety of different vantage points. And I hope that what they've shared ignites even more energy and commitment to racial and housing justice, a focus, a commitment, and a path forward. I want to thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. Have a good afternoon.